The proctors came not with warships, but with gardens. For a century, they cultivated humanity, tending to the Sol system as if it were a beautiful but volatile flower in their vast cosmic arboretum. They called themselves the Stewardship, a single, ancient species whose forms resembled willows carved from living pearl, their limbs swaying with a grace that belied a galactic empire's strength. They arrived in the wake of humanity's self-inflicted twilight wars, finding a species scarred, brilliant, and seething with a chaotic energy they termed the fever. It was the disease of ambition, the sickness of individuality, the beautiful, terrible madness that drove humans to create symphonies and atom bombs with equal passion. So they imposed the quarantine, a gentle but absolute cage. Trade was a trickle of approved technologies, communication a sterile, monitored feed, and the dream of the stars was replaced by the silent, shimmering presence of the proctor's orbital stations, hanging like moons of judgment over Earth and Mars. They were not conquerors, they were healers, and their cure was a slow, patient smothering of the human spirit. Kalen Rourke had once believed in the cure as a xenobotanist on the Ganymede bioacclimation arcology. He had worked alongside the proctors, his hands deep in the sterile soil of their experiments. His life's work was to isolate the very genes that coded for humanity's fire, to find a way to soothe the fever into a manageable, harmonious hum. He had seen the proctor's logic. He understood their fear of a species that could love and hate so fiercely that it burned its own world. He saw the peace they offered a long, quiet twilight of existence, free from strife and genius alike. He was a good man, a logical man, a man who had accepted the cage because he believed the beast inside it was real. That faith shattered on the day of the gentle sublimation. It wasn't an execution order. It was a final diagnosis delivered with the proctor's infuriating, serene pity. The announcement rippled through the system on all channels. The voice of the Proctor Primus, a melodic, sorrowful chime that spoke of humanity's incurable condition. The experiment had failed. The fever was too deep, too intertwined with the human soul to be merely soothed. Therefore, the stewardship, in its infinite compassion, would begin a multi-generational atmospheric treatment. A tailored retrovirus, delivered as a shimmering golden haze, would slowly rewrite the human genome, dialing down aggression, erasing ambition, and ensuring that within 3 generations, humanity would become a placid, content, and ultimately manageable species. They would be happy. The Proctor Primus assured them. They would forget they had ever dreamed of touching the stars, and in forgetting, they would find peace. It was a lobotomy disguised as a blessing, the murder of a soul delivered as a gift. While the world leaders on Earth stammered out diplomatic protests they knew were meaningless. Kalen stood frozen in the arcology's central arboretum, the scent of alien blossoms thick in the air. He looked at the proctor he had worked with for a decade, a being of light and grace named Xylo. And for the first time, he did not see a benevolent guide. He saw a gardener holding a pair of shears, ready to prune a rose into a featureless shrub. In that moment, the fever, the glorious, terrible fever he had been trained to suppress, erupted in his chest not as rage, but as a cold, diamond-hard clarity. He wasn't a patient to be cured. He was a prisoner on death row. That night, Kalen Rourke, the quiet botanist, became a thief. He didn't steal weapons or ships. He stole seeds. For years, the Proctors had been studying a flora native to their homeworld, a parasitic orchid that fed on the electrochemical signals of complex emotion. It was their evolutionary counterweight, a biological inhibitor that helped them maintain their legendary calm. They had brought it to Ganymede to study its potential use on humanity. But Kalen saw a different application. He saw a weapon. He downloaded every byte of classified research, every note on the orchid's psychoactive pollen and its effect on the Proctor's unique neurology, a system so placid and unused to shock it was, in its own way, incredibly fragile. Then, with the stolen data and a canister of hybridized spores, he fled. He didn't go to Earth's ineffectual governments. He went to the forgotten places, the dark corners of the system where the quarantine had bred a different kind of human. He went to the asteroid miners of the belt, their bodies augmented to withstand the void, their minds hardened by isolation. He went to the code ghosts of Mars, hackers who lived in the digital shadows, fighting the stewardship's information control with their own silent wars. He went to the artists, the poets, the musicians, the dreamers whose work was deemed symptomatic of advanced fever and suppressed. He gathered the disavowed, the brilliant, the angry, and the unbroken. He didn't offer them a war of ships and guns. He offered them a war of ideas, a biological insurgency. They found their sanctuary in a place the Proctors had abandoned, a colossal, half-finished terraforming rig adrift in the Oort cloud, a metal behemoth designed to process comets for water ice. It was ugly, functional, and far from the Proctors' elegant watchfulness. They named it Hephaestus, and within its cold, metallic guts, they began to cultivate their revenge. They were not soldiers. They were the Unchained. And Kalen Rourke was no longer a botanist. He was the architect of a plague. Their first target was the symbol of the stewardship's gentle oppression, the Tranquility Spire, an orbital station over Earth that pulsed with the soft, white light of their pacifying energy fields. It was from here they managed the quarantine, their serene voices issuing commands that kept humanity kneeling. A direct assault was impossible. Instead, Kalen and his new followers retrofitted a simple ice hauler, filling its cargo hold not with ice, but with a fine, invisible dust, the weaponized pollen of the Proctor orchid, genetically tailored to induce not calm, but its terrifying opposite. The ice hauler, flying on an old, forgotten trajectory, docked with the Tranquility Spire for a routine resource delivery. Its human pilot, a blank-faced collaborator who had long ago accepted the stewardship's peace. No alarms were raised. The Proctors saw only what they expected to see, a docile human performing a simple task. An hour later, the pollen was introduced into the station's primary atmospheric circulation system. The effect was not immediate. It was a slow, creeping infiltration of the Proctors' minds. These were beings who had evolved over millennia to exist in a state of perfect, meditative balance. They did not know fear. They did not know panic. They did not know rage. And then, suddenly, they did. A Proctor monitoring Earth's weather patterns felt a sudden, inexplicable tightening in its reedy chest, a sensation akin to a predator's eyes on its back. Another, composing a report on Martian agricultural yields, found its thoughts scattering like leaves in a wind, its elegant script devolving into jagged, meaningless scrawls. On the command bridge, the Proctor overseer, a being who had not felt a moment of disquiet in 3 centuries, was gripped by a wave of baseless terror so profound it dropped the data slate it was holding, the shattering crystal echoing in the sudden, ringing silence. They were experiencing the fever, a concentrated alien dose of the very chaos they had dedicated their existence to eradicating. They had no defense, no mental framework to process the onslaught of irrational dread, suspicion, and aggression. The station did not fall to explosions. It fell to insanity. Alarms began to shriek as proctors, lost in paroxysms of paranoia, sealed bulkheads, rerouted power, and turned security systems on empty corridors. Their calm, melodious language became a cacophony of sharp, panicked clicks and whistles. Their graceful, flowing movements became jerky, fearful twitches from Hephaestus. Kalen and the Unchained watched the data streams, their faces illuminated by the ghostly light of their screens. They saw the elegant white light of the Tranquility Spire flicker, stutter, and then shift to a frantic, pulsing red. They had not killed a single proctor, but they had shattered their sacred peace. They had held up a mirror and forced their jailers to see the reflection of the beast they so feared. As the first proctor ship scrambled from Jupiter to investigate the chaos on the spire, a single, unencrypted message was broadcast from the rogue terraforming rig. It was Kalen's voice, no longer the mild tone of a scientist, but the cold, steady voice of a man who had chosen his path. "You sought to cure us of our humanity," it said, the words echoing through the Sol system, reaching every human on every planet and moon. "But you have only taught us how to weaponize it. The quarantine is over. The fever is spreading." There was no grand speech, no declaration of a new empire. It was simpler than that. It was the sound of a cage breaking, the promise that humanity would not fade into a gentle twilight. They would burn. And now, they would make sure they took their gardeners with them into the fire. The immediate aftermath of the spire's fall was a profound, system-wide silence. The proctors, for the first time in living memory, were stunned. Their response was not swift or violent. It was methodical and unnervingly quiet. They sealed the Tranquility Spire, declaring it a biohazard zone, and broadcast a carefully worded message about a systems cascade failure, never once acknowledging the attack. To admit that a handful of quarantine primitives could touch them, let alone cripple their primary command hub with a cloud of pollen, was an ideological impossibility. But beneath the placid surface, the machine of the stewardship began to turn. Their patrol ships moved in tighter, more aggressive formations around Earth. The trickle of trade goods stopped entirely. The gentle sublimation project was not canceled, but accelerated. Its timeline moved up from generations to a single decade. They would not engage the Unchained directly, for that would be to acknowledge them as a legitimate threat. Instead, they would simply hasten the cure, solving the problem of the rebellion by erasing the species that spawned it. On Hephaestus, the mood was a tense mixture of elation and dread. They had won a battle, a spectacular symbolic victory that had awakened a flicker of defiance across the system. Volunteers began to find their way to the Orc cloud in stolen ships and converted freighters, more engineers with forbidden designs, more hackers with stolen proctor codes, more soldiers from Earth's old, mothballed defense forces who were tired of being treated like children. The Unchained grew, their makeshift city within the terraformer roaring with the clang of metal and the fire of new forges. Kalen Rourke found himself at the center of it all, A reluctant leader elevated to the status of a prophet. He had never wanted this. He had wanted a quiet life among his plants. But the universe had demanded more. He spent his days and nights poring over the stolen Proctor data, searching for new weaknesses, new ways to turn their biology, their philosophy, their very nature against them. He was no longer just a botanist. He was a student of his enemy, learning their anatomy not to heal, but to kill. His second in command, a woman named Anya Sharma, was his perfect foil. Where Kalen was cold and methodical, Anya was pure fire, a former Martian kinetic artist. Her work involved sculpting with controlled demolitions, a craft the Proctors had deemed the epitome of the fever. She saw the universe not as a set of biological systems to be manipulated, but as a canvas awaiting a violent, beautiful statement. They think we're a disease. Kalen, she would say, her hands always smudged with grease and chemical stains from the weapons labs. Let's be the plague they can't cure. It was Anya who pushed for their next move. Kalen was content to build their strength, to remain a ghost in the dark, but she argued for escalation. They're ignoring us because they think we're an anomaly, she insisted in a heated strategy session, her voice echoing in the cavernous command center. We need to show them we're a symptom of what every human feels. We need to make them bleed. The target she proposed was Audacious, the Titania Relay, a massive communication hub orbiting Uranus that was the linchpin of the stewardship's control over the outer system. It was heavily defended, not by warships, but by automated defense platforms and a swarm of AI-controlled drones the Proctors preferred to keep their own hands clean. Kalen saw the risks, the sheer impossibility of a direct assault. Anya saw the opportunity. The Unchained's fleet was a pathetic joke, a collection of retrofitted miners, smugglers' ships, and the single, lumbering Hephaestus. They couldn't win a conventional fight. So, they wouldn't fight one. Kalen, applying his biological insight to the cold realm of technology, devised a plan. The Proctor's AI was flawless, logical, and efficient. It was also, like its creators, utterly unprepared for chaos. The plan, codenamed Operation Cacophony, was not to destroy the relay, but to deafen it. A fleet of 50 small, repurposed mining drones, little more than engines strapped to metal frames, was launched from Hephaestus. They were loaded not with explosives, but with powerful signal jammers, each one broadcasting pure, unstructured noise across thousands of frequencies, scrambled data, snippets of banned human music, readings from obscure poetry, the static-laced screams from old war films. It was a digital manifestation of the fever. As the drone swarm approached the Titania Relay, the Proctor defense systems reacted as expected. Their AI analyzed the incoming threats, prioritized targets, and began methodically shooting them down. But they couldn't shoot fast enough. For every drone destroyed, 3 more took its place, and the wall of noise grew exponentially. The relay's AI, designed for the quiet order of Proctor communications, was overwhelmed by the sheer, meaningless volume of the data. Its processing cores began to overheat as it tried to analyze, categorize, and counter a threat that had no logic, no purpose other than to be loud and confusing. While the defense grid was drowning in digital screams, a single, larger ship, the Stray Dog, slipped through the chaos. It was a battered ore hauler crewed by Anya and a small strike team. They didn't board the relay. They attached themselves to its outer hull, near the primary power conduits. There, they planted not a bomb, but a device of Kalen's design, a resonant frequency emitter. It was a simple, brutal piece of engineering that did one thing: it vibrated at the precise harmonic frequency of the crystalline material used in the Proctor's power systems. The Unchained didn't blow the relay up, they shook it apart from the inside. The resonant vibrations traveled through the station's superstructure, growing in intensity until the delicate power crystals, the heart of the station, began to crack. The lights on the Titania relay flickered, then died. The overwhelming digital noise from the Unchained drones was replaced by an even more terrifying silence. The stewardship's eyes and ears in the outer system had gone blind and deaf. The message of this attack was different from the first. The assault on the spire had been a psychological blow, a violation. This was a strategic amputation. It proved the Unchained were not just a nuisance. They were a capable, intelligent threat that could dissect and disable the Proctor's own technology. Back on Earth, the news, pieced together from amateur astronomers and leaked data from sympathetic factions within the old governments, spread like wildfire. The Unchained were no longer just rebels, they were heroes. Uprisings began to simmer in the Martian domes and the sprawling arcologies of Luna. People started looking up at the sky not with resignation, but with a renewed, dangerous hope. In his sterile meditation chamber on a warship near Jupiter, the Proctor Primus received the report. Its pearlescent skin seemed to dim for a moment, the only outward sign of its disturbance. The humans were adapting. They were weaponizing their own chaotic nature, turning it into a tactical doctrine. The gentle, impatient approach had failed. The gardener could no longer afford to simply prune the flower. It was time to salt the earth. The Primus issued a single, quiet command that would change the nature of the conflict forever. It dispatched the Wardens. They were not the usual Proctor envoys or observers. The Wardens were a subclass of their species, spoken of only in whispers, a genetic throwback to a more primal, predatory era in their own evolutionary history. They were larger, faster, and they did not carry the burden of compassion. They were the tools the stewardship used when healing failed and surgery brutal. Bloody surgery was required. They were being sent to the Sol system with a simple directive to excise the infection, one human at a time, if necessary. The war for humanity's soul was about to become a war for its body, and Kalen Rourke, watching the first reports of Warden ships translating from hyperspace near Saturn, felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He had taught his enemy how to feel fear. Now, he suspected, they were about to return the lesson. The arrival of the Wardens was a violation of the sky, where the regular Proctor ships were things of light and elegance, silent and serene. The Warden vessels were brutalist wedges of obsidian black material that seemed to drink the starlight around them. They moved with a predatory swiftness, their engines leaving faint, shimmering distortions in space-time, like a shark's wake in dark water. They did not patrol, they hunted. On Hephaestus, the initial euphoria of their victories curdled into a cold, gnawing anxiety. The data streams from their deep space sensors painted a terrifying picture. The Warden ships were smaller, more numerous, and their energy signatures were unlike anything Kalen had seen in the Proctor archives. They weren't powered by the same calm, efficient systems. They pulsed with a raw, barely contained power. The stewardship, in its infinite wisdom, broadcast a new message to the human worlds. The Proctor Primus's melodic voice now tinged with a clinical resolve. The message spoke of a dangerous escalation in the fever's pathology, a delirium that now required a more direct and potent therapeutic intervention. The wardens were not soldiers, the Primus explained, but restorers, specialists in calming the most acute and violent outbreaks. Their presence was a sign, not of war, but of the stewardship's unwavering commitment to healing their troubled wards. It was a lie, so profound, so patronizing, that it felt more violent than any declaration of war. They were going to dissect humanity and call it a cure. The wardens did not search for Hephaestus. To do so would be to admit the Unchained were a centralized threat. Instead, they chose a target that would serve as a lesson. Their choice was Olympus Village, the largest of the Martian domes, which had become a hotbed of open rebellion after the fall of the Titania Relay. Its citizens had expelled the few Proctor observers among them and had begun broadcasting messages of solidarity with the Unchained, their defiance a raw, beautiful, and foolish beacon in the darkness. Anya watched the first warden ships descend on Mars from the command center of Hephaestus, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of a console. "They're making an example of them," she whispered, her voice tight with a mixture of fury and guilt. She had wanted to awaken the people. She had never considered the price of their waking. The attack was not an orbital bombardment. That was too impersonal, too clean for the lesson the wardens intended to teach. 3 of their black ships landed just outside the dome, their forms stark against the red Martian dust. What emerged was a perversion of the Proctor form. The wardens were bipedal, but they were not graceful willows. They were taller, leaner, their pearlescent skin replaced with a mottled gray carapace that seemed to shift and harden in the thin light. Their limbs ended not in delicate fingers, but in sharp, obsidian-like claws, and their heads, normally smooth and featureless, were ridged with what looked like sensory crests. They moved with a loping, predatory gait, carrying long, staff-like weapons that crackled with contained energy. The Unchained watched through a hacked Martian news drone as the wardens simply sliced open the dome's transparent canopy, the atmosphere inside exploding outwards in a plume of crystallized vapor. They strode into the depressurizing city, their movements unhurried, as the screams of the colonists were swallowed by the sudden vacuum. They did not kill indiscriminately. They moved through the streets, their strange weapons discharging bolts of disruptive energy that didn't just kill, but unmade, causing human bodies to collapse into clouds of shimmering dust. They were targeting the leaders of the rebellion, the broadcasters, the organizers, with terrifying precision. It was a systematic eradication, a surgical strike designed to excise the heart of the Martian resistance while the whole system watched in horror. "We have to do something," Anya choked out, turning to Kaelin. Her face was pale, the artist's fire in her eyes replaced with a desperate horror. "We can send the Swift Squadron. They can hit the warden ships while they're grounded. Give the people a chance to fight back." Kaelin's mind was racing, cold logic at war with the raw emotion of the spectacle. "It's a trap. Anya. They want us to respond. They're baiting us." "And what if they are?" she shot back, her voice rising. "We can't just sit here and watch them be slaughtered. We told them to be brave. We can't abandon them the moment their bravery costs them something." Her pain was a blade, and it cut through his caution. He looked at the faces of the other commanders in the room, saw the same desperate need to act reflected in their eyes. Against his better judgment, he gave the order. The swift squadron, 6 of the Unchained's fastest and best-armed ships, broke from the cover of the Oort cloud and burned hard for Mars. They were commanded by a man named Jorik, a former Belter asteroid racer and one of Anya's oldest friends, a man who flew his ship like it was an extension of his own nervous system. Their plan was to use their speed to perform a low-altitude strafing run on the grounded Warden vessels before they could react. It was a daring, reckless plan born of desperation. The Wardens reacted before the squadron was even halfway through the asteroid belt. 3 of their black ships detached from their high orbit over Mars and moved to intercept, not with the stately pace of Proctor vessels, but with the shocking velocity of thrown knives. On the bridge of Hephaestus, they watched the tactical display as the red icons of the swift squadron converged with the black icons of the Wardens. The battle was brutally short. The Warden ships didn't use energy projectors or missiles. They fired what appeared to be solid projectiles, small, dense objects that accelerated to a significant fraction of the speed of light. These kinetic impactors didn't explode. They simply passed through the Unchained ships, punching clean, catastrophically destructive holes through their reactors, their bridges, their life support. Jorik's ship, the Gilded Thorn, dodged the first 2 shots, his Belter instincts screaming at him through his flight stick. He managed to get off a single volley of plasma torpedoes. They struck one of the Warden ships, splashing harmlessly against a dark, shimmering energy field. Then a 3rd kinetic slug hit the Gilded Thorn dead center. The ship's icon on the tactical display vanished without a flicker. The other 5 ships were dispatched in under a minute. There were no distress calls, no final words. Just 6 red icons winking out of existence, one after another, in the cold, unforgiving void between Jupiter and Mars. The silence in the command center was heavier than any planet. Anya stood frozen, her eyes locked on the spot where Jorik's icon had been. A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. The fire in her was gone, replaced by a hollow, echoing emptiness. The Unchained had been swatted out of the sky like insects. They were not heroes. They were not even a plague. They were a nuisance. And the stewardship had finally decided to call the exterminator. The defeat shattered the fragile morale of the Unchained. The volunteers who had flocked to Hephaestus, drawn by the promise of heroic rebellion, now saw the stark reality of their situation. They were outgunned, outmaneuvered, and facing an enemy who could kill them without effort and without remorse. Whispers of desertion began to circulate through the cold corridors of the old terraformer. It was Kalen who held them together, his own grief and fear locked behind a mask of cold resolve. He addressed the assembled crews in the main cargo bay, his voice steady and devoid of false hope. "Yorick and the Swift Squadron are dead," he began, his words falling like stones into the quiet crowd. "They died because we were arrogant. We saw a monster, and we tried to fight it with its own tools with speed and violence. And we failed. We failed because we are not them. We cannot win by being a lesser version of our enemy." He paused, letting the weight of his admission settle. "But their deaths will not be a lesson in futility. It will be a lesson in methodology. We tried to fight the Warden's body, and it is too strong. So now, we will go back to fighting its mind." He dismissed the gathering and retreated to his private lab, a section of the old hydroponics bay he had converted into a sanctuary. Anya found him there hours later, standing before a glowing specimen tank. Inside, a single Proctor orchid floated, its pale petals gently unfurling. She looked broken, her usual vibrant energy replaced by a weary stoicism. "There's nothing left to fight with. Kalen," she said, her voice flat. "They're too strong, too fast. We're done." Kalen didn't turn. He pointed a long, hair-steady finger at the orchid. "We used this to give the Proctors something they didn't have fear. We introduced an alien emotion into a placid system, and it broke them. The Wardens are different. They aren't placid. They're primal. They are aggression and predatory instinct given form." He finally turned to face her, and in his eyes, she saw not despair, but a chilling, scientific curiosity. "What do you think happens?" he asked softly. "If you take a mind already tuned for aggression and you feed it a catalyst, what happens when you don't introduce a new emotion, but instead you amplify the one that already defines their entire existence? You don't get fear. You don't get panic." He tapped the glass of the tank, and the orchid pulsed with a faint, inner light. "You get rage, pure, uncontrollable, self-devouring rage. You get a berserker. You get a weapon that destroys itself." Anya stared at him, a flicker of understanding dawning in her hollow eyes. He was talking about turning the Warden's greatest strength into their most profound weakness. He was planning to brew a new kind of madness, a fever tailored not for the gentle gardeners, but for their savage dogs of war. It was a monstrous idea, an act of biological warfare so profound it would rewrite the definition of cruelty. And in that moment, seeing the cold, brilliant light in Kalen's eyes, Anya knew it was their only hope. The work of creating the catalyst was a quiet, secret thing, conducted in the deepest, most shielded section of Hephaestus's old reactor core. Kalen worked with a team of only 3 other xenobiologists, all of them defectors from the same Ganymede arcology where he had once worked. They were the only ones who truly understood the monstrous artistry of what they were attempting. There was no clean room, no gleaming Proctor technology. Their lab was a tangle of repurposed pipes, scavenged nutrient feeders, and jury-rigged gene splicers that hummed with a dangerous amount of power. The air was thick with the cloying, sweet scent of the orchids, which now grew in eerie, glowing rows, their pale petals bathing the cramped space in a sickly white light. They were not merely cultivating the plants. They were torturing them, exposing them to amplified recordings of human rage, feeding them a nutrient solution laced with stress hormones, forcing them to evolve, to concentrate their psychoactive pollen into something far more potent and specific. They called it the catalyst, not because it created an emotion, but because it stripped away every inhibitor, every layer of discipline and reason, leaving only the primal, screaming core of a being's nature. For the Wardens, that core was pure, predatory violence. While Kalen lost himself in the chilling elegance of his biological equation, Anya Sharma found a new purpose. The grief for Jorik had not faded, but it had calcified into a hard, cold resolve. The artist was gone, replaced by a spy master. She became the link to the fractured remnants of resistance scattered throughout the system, the voice in the dark that whispered hope and coordinated sabotage. Her new canvas was the web of Proctor surveillance. Her new sculptures were the blind spots she created within it. Her focus became Mars. The slaughter at Olympus Village had not crushed the Martian spirit. It had forged it into a silent, simmering hatred. Survivors had scattered into the old, abandoned mining tunnels and forgotten exploratory bunkers that honeycombed the planet's crust. They were ghosts, living in the shadows of the new Warden occupation. And Anya was their only connection to the outside universe. She spent her days in a darkened comms bay, her voice a low murmur, coordinating supply drops via automated meteorite landers, trading stolen Warden patrol routes for Hephaestus's technical support, and, most importantly, laying the groundwork for Kalen's plan. The delivery system they devised was a masterstroke of audacity, born from Anya's intimate knowledge of Martian infrastructure. Before the Proctors, humanity had spent a century trying to terraform Mars. The effort had failed, but its colossal machinery remained dozens of atmospheric processors, each the size of a city block, now silent and half buried in the red dust. The Wardens, with their arrogant focus on active threats, saw them as nothing more than ancient monuments to human failure. They didn't know that Anya's father had been one of the project's lead engineers, and that she knew the location of a maintenance conduit that led directly to the central dispersion fan of the processor in the heart of Valles Marineris, less than 20 kilometers from the Warden's primary command garrison. The plan was terrifyingly simple. Anya's ghosts on Mars would carry a canister of the refined catalyst dust to the processor. On her signal, they would activate the machine for a single 10-minute cycle using a set of override codes her father had designed decades ago. The processor's fans, built to churn a planet's atmosphere, would turn the catalyst into an invisible, inescapable aerosol, and the prevailing canyon winds would carry it directly into the heart of the Warden encampment. The tension on Hephaestus in the days leading up to the operation was a palpable thing. The crew moved with a grim, quiet efficiency, the memory of the swift squadron's fate hanging over them like a shroud. There was no talk of victory, only of necessity. They were no longer fighting for freedom, they were fighting to survive, and they had entrusted their survival to a cloud of weaponized insanity. Anya barely slept, her face illuminated by the flickering light of her encrypted comms channel as she guided her three-person team across the treacherous Martian landscape. She listened to their strained breathing, felt their fear across the void, and offered them the only comfort she could, the promise that their sacrifice would be remembered. Finally, the night of the operation arrived. In the command center, a hushed crowd gathered around the main holographic display, which showed a topographical map of Valles Marineris. A single, blinking green light marked the position of Anya's team. A larger, ominous red zone marked the Warden garrison. Kalen stood at the center of it all, his face as still and pale as the orchids in his lab. "They're in position," Anya announced, her voice a dry rasp. She took a deep breath. "Initiating sequence. Now." For a long minute, nothing happened. The green light remained steady. Then, a new icon flickered to life on the map of the atmospheric processor, its energy signature, dormant for 50 years, bloomed on their screens. "It's active," a tech officer breathed. "Dispersion commencing." On the visual feed from a tiny, high-altitude surveillance drone they had managed to place weeks earlier, they saw a faint shimmer in the air near the processor, a brief distortion in the starlight before it vanished. The invisible cloud of the catalyst began its silent journey down the canyon. The waiting was the worst part. Every second stretched into an eternity. They watched the red zone of the Warden garrison, searching for any sign, any reaction. For 5 minutes, there was nothing. A cold dread began to seep into the room. Had it failed, was the dosage too weak then? The first thermal spike appeared. A single, brilliant flash of heat inside the garrison. Then another, and another. "What is that?" someone asked. "Weapon discharge," Kalen answered, his voice a clinical whisper. "Their own sidearms." The garrison's energy signature began to fluctuate wildly. The tightly controlled power grid of the base dissolved into a chaotic mess of surges and blackouts. Their sensors, tuned to pick up electromagnetic frequencies, were flooded with a new signal, a low, subsonic pulse emanating from the garrison, a vibration of pure, resonant rage. It was the collective psychic scream of 1,000 predators being pushed past the edge of sanity. The drone's visual feed, zoomed in as close as it dared, was a grainy, horrifying tableau. They saw warden figures, their gray carapaces gleaming under the harsh floodlights of the base, tearing into each other with their claws and their crackling energy staffs. Disciplined military formations devolved into a writhing, fratricidal mob. Their black ships, parked in neat rows on the landing pads, suddenly powered up. One of them lifted, hovered for a moment, and then unleashed its main kinetic cannon directly into the command center of the base. The resulting explosion ripped a hole in the canyon floor, silencing a quarter of the garrison instantly. The other ships began firing at each other, their silent, deadly projectiles crisscrossing the night sky in a suicidal ballet of black-on-black violence. The Unchained watched in stunned, sickened silence. There was no cheering, no celebration. The raw, primal brutality of what they were witnessing was beyond triumph. They were not watching a battle. They were watching a mind devour itself. They were watching the ultimate expression of the fever, a madness of their own creation. The slaughter lasted for 47 minutes. When it was over, the garrison was a cratered, burning ruin. The energy signals had vanished. The thermal spikes had faded. There was only silence. Anya closed her eyes, her body trembling slightly. She had avenged Yorick. She had avenged Olympus Village, but the victory felt like ashes in her mouth. Kalen stared at the screen, his expression unreadable. He had hypothesized this outcome, had calculated it, but the reality was more absolute than he had ever imagined. He had turned his enemy's mind into a weapon pointed at its own heart, and it had worked perfectly. On his flagship orbiting the gas giant of Jupiter, the Proctor Primus watched the same data streams from Mars. It registered the total loss of the Warden garrison, the unique energy signature of the catalyst, and the chillingly precise method of its delivery. For a long, profound moment, the ancient being felt a sensation it had not experienced in millennia, an emotion utterly alien to its placid nature. It was not fear. It was not anger. It was a cold, clear, and unfamiliar feeling, respect. The human assailant Rourke was not just a rabid animal lashing out. He was an artist of poisons, a strategist of the soul. He was a peer. The stewardship's approach had been wrong from the start. They had treated humanity as a patient with a disease. They now understood they were facing a rival biologist, one who was just as brilliant and far more ruthless than they were. The Primus turned its serene gaze away from the data of Mars and issued a series of new, uncharacteristically swift commands. The time for healing, for pruning, for restoration was over. The garden had spawned a weed so clever and so toxic that it threatened the entire ecosystem. The only remaining solution was fire. A total system-wide biological cleansing. The gentle sublimation was no longer a plan for humanity's future. It was now the instrument of its immediate extinction. The Proctor Primus did not announce its new, final solution. There were no broadcasts, no ultimatums, no theatrical pronouncements of doom. The change was felt not in words, but in a profound and terrifying shift in the stewardship's posture. Their graceful, willow-like ships, which had maintained a distant, observational orbit, began to descend. They moved in vast, silent formations, taking up positions over every major human population center Earth, Luna, the scattered settlements of the Belt, and the surviving domes of Mars. They were no longer moons of judgment. They were clouds of poison, waiting to rain. On Hephaestus, the victory over the Martian wardens was a hollow, fleeting thing. Kalen's intelligence network, pieced together from sympathetic Proctor lower castes and hacked deep space sensors, brought him the chilling truth. The fleet movements were not a prelude to invasion. They were a deployment. The ships were positioning themselves to release the sublimation retrovirus not as a gentle, multi-generational haze, but as a fast-acting, high-concentration plague. Kalen's projections were stark and unforgiving. 99% human extinction within a single year. They had not won a war. They had merely angered the gardener into burning the entire garden to the ground. The mood on Hephaestus turned from grim resolve to quiet despair. They had fought with cunning and ferocity, but they were now facing an enemy who had decided that the cost of fighting was higher than the cost of simply wiping the board clean. They were an island of defiance in a system that was about to be drowned. Food and water rationing became severe. The hum of the forges and labs quieted as all non-essential power was diverted to life support and the long-range sensors that were their only window to their impending doom. They were no longer a rebellion. They were a tomb, waiting for the universe to seal the door. It was during this long, dark twilight that Kalen Rourke changed. The cold, detached scientist who had viewed the war as a complex biological problem began to grapple with its human cost. He spent hours watching the live feeds from Earth children playing in parks in the shadow of the silent ships, vendors selling food in bustling markets, lovers walking hand in hand along riversides, all of them oblivious to the sterile, airborne death that was being prepared for them. He had seen humanity as a concept, a species defined by the fever. Now, he saw people, billions of them, and he was overwhelmed by the weight of their stolen futures. He began to search not for a weapon, but for an answer. He delved deeper into the stolen Proctor archives, past the schematics and the biology, into their history, their philosophy, their art. He sought to understand not how they fought, but why they were so afraid. He discovered texts that spoke of a time before the stewardship, a dark age in their own history they called the Sundering, when their species, once diverse and emotional, had nearly annihilated itself in a series of psychic wars. Their enforced serenity, their galactic crusade against chaotic species, their obsession with the fever, it was all born from a deep, ancient, and unhealed trauma. They were not gardeners tending a flower. They were survivors of a forest fire, desperately trying to stamp out every spark they saw, terrified it would ignite another inferno. This revelation did not inspire pity in Kalen. It illuminated a new, desperate path. The Proctor's greatest strength, their unshakable unity and placid resolve, was also their greatest vulnerability. It was a carefully constructed dam holding back a flood of ancestral terror. Kalen had already proven he could make them feel fear and rage. Now, he wondered, what would happen if he could make them remember his new project was codenamed Operation Minimosity, after the Greek Titaness of memory. It was not a weapon designed to kill, but a virus of the mind, a psychoactive agent that would attack the very core of the Proctor's identity. Using the same orchid base as the catalyst, he and his team began to synthesize a new compound, one designed to interface with the unique tele-empathic field that bound the Proctor species together. It wouldn't induce a new emotion, it would unlock an old one. It was designed to shatter the psychic dam of their serenity and flood their collective consciousness with the raw, terrifying memories of the Sundering. He would force them to relive their own near extinction, to feel the chaos and violence they had spent 1,000,000 years trying to forget. He would cure them of their peace. Anya Sharma, watching him work, saw the change in him. The cold fire in his eyes had been replaced by a deep, weary sorrow. "You're trying to reason with them," she said, her voice laced with skepticism as she stood in the doorway of his lab. "They're past reason. Kalen, they're going to kill us all." "I'm not trying to reason with them," he replied, not looking up from a complex molecular model projected in the air before him. "I'm trying to make them feel the same horror they're about to inflict on us. Empathy is a weapon they've forgotten they possess. I'm going to remind them." The delivery system for this final, desperate gambit had to be perfect. They could not launch a ship. The Proctor fleet would obliterate it instantly. They could not use a drone. It would be shot down. The virus had to be delivered directly to the Proctor Primus itself. Their only hope was to turn the stewardship's own network against them. For months, Anya's team of code ghosts had been fighting a silent war in the digital ether, searching for a crack in the Proctor's flawless information security. They finally found one, not in a military system, but in the most mundane and overlooked of places, the archival network that managed the Proctor's vast collection of biological samples, the cosmic arboretum from which they drew their identity as gardeners. Deep within this network, they found a dormant, low-priority transport protocol, a back door used for shipping seed samples and soil data between their research outposts. It was a tiny, forgotten flaw, but it was enough. The plan was a suicide mission of breathtaking complexity. They would encode the Namazan virus into a stream of benign botanical data. Then, using a series of chained relays and quantum-entangled transmitters, they would bounce this data packet through 6 neutral systems before injecting it into the archival network. From there, it would piggyback on a routine data sync scheduled to be sent directly to the Proctor Primus's flagship. It was a digital needle in a galactic haystack, and every step had to be perfectly timed. If a single relay failed or a single line of code was detected, the entire network would lock down, and their chance would be lost forever. As the day of the planned transmission approached, a strange sense of calm settled over Hephaestus. The despair had not vanished, but it had been joined by a sense of purpose. They were going to make one last, defiant sound against the encroaching silence. They had thrown their message in a bottle into the cosmic ocean, and now they could only wait and see if it would be heard. Anya and Kalen stood together on the observation deck, looking out at the distant, cold stars. The lights of the Proctor fleet over Earth were a beautiful, terrible constellation that had become a permanent fixture in their sky. "If this works," Anya said softly, her voice barely a whisper, "what do you think happens?" "I don't know," Kalen admitted, his reflection a pale ghost in the reinforced glass. Maybe nothing. Or maybe they'll finally see us. Not as a disease, but as a reflection of a part of themselves they tried to bury. The moment came. In the silent, humming command center, the lead code ghost, a young woman who went only by the name Echo, gave a single, sharp nod. The transmission began. They watched the data packet's journey on the main screen, a single point of light hopping from system to system, a fragile spark of hope flying through the void. It reached the archival network, the Proctor firewalls, programmed to scan for weapons code and military intrusions. Let the harmless botanical data pass without a second glance. The packet merged with the data sync. "It's in," Echo breathed, her voice trembling. "It's on its way to the Primus." Aboard its flagship, the Proctor Primus was in a state of deep meditation, its mind connected to the collective consciousness of its fleet, preparing to issue the final command that would begin the sublimation. It felt the arrival of the routine data sync, a familiar, soothing stream of information from its beloved archives. And then it felt something else. A flicker, a discordant note in the symphony of its mind. The Mimozan virus, disguised as data, unfolded itself within the Primus's consciousness. It was not a violent intrusion, but a soft, insidious whisper, a memory that was not its own, but was now part of it. It saw fire, not the clean, sterilizing fire of its sublimation projectors, but a chaotic, roaring inferno. It heard screams, not of aliens, but of its own kind, their telepathic voices, raw with terror and hate. It felt the psychic shockwaves of planet-shattering weapons, wielded by Proctor against Proctor. The dam broke. A million years of suppressed trauma, the collective agony of the sundering, crashed into the Primus's serene mind, its placid consciousness fractured, shattered by the raw, undiluted horror of its own history. The agony was not confined to the Primus. Through the tele-empathic field that connected them all, the psychic scream of the Primus echoed through the minds of every Proctor in the fleet. They all felt it. They all remembered. On the bridge of a ship over London, a Proctor pilot suddenly recoiled from his controls, its graceful limbs curling inward in a posture of primal fear. In the engine room of a vessel above Beijing, a technician shrieked a silent, mental shriek and collapsed. The serene, unified consciousness of the stewardship dissolved into a cacophony of individual terror. The ships began to drift from their perfect formations. Their lights flickered erratically. Their mission, their purpose, their entire philosophy of ordered peace was consumed by the resurrected ghost of their own chaotic past. The great, silent machine of extinction had just been given a soul, and that soul was screaming. The psychic shattering of the stewardship was not a loud, explosive event. It was a deep, silent, seismic convulsion. From the observation deck of Hephaestus, the Unchained watched as the perfect, geometric formations of the Proctor fleet began to lose their coherence. Ships drifted aimlessly, their running lights flickering like dying embers. Some turned slowly, ponderously, as if lost in a fog. A few simply went dark, their power systems failing as their crews. Minds lost in a maelstrom of ancestral terror abandoned their posts. There was no retreat, no surrender. The fleet was simply breaking. The tele-empathic network that had been the Proctor's greatest strength, the source of their unity and serene power, had become a conduit for shared madness. The memory of the sundering, unleashed by Kalen's virus, was now a feedback loop of psychic agony, each proctor's terror amplifying the terror of its neighbor, the entire species trapped in a collective, waking nightmare of its own violent past. On Hephaestus, a stunned silence gave way to a dawning, incredulous hope. They had done it. They had not defeated their enemy. They had broken its mind. The immediate threat of the sublimation was gone, the hand holding the poison phial now trembling too violently to act. But the silence from the Proctor fleet was replaced by a new, chaotic, and unpredictable danger. Some Proctor ships, their crews driven by a resurrected primal aggression, began to fire on each other, their elegant energy beams lashing out in flashes of blue and white against the blackness of space. Others simply fled, accelerating wildly out of the system, their drives leaving distorted trails of light as they vanished into the void. The great, monolithic empire of the stewardship was not falling. It was disintegrating, atomizing into 1,000 fractured, terrified pieces. "What have we done?" Anya whispered, her face a mask of awe and horror. She had wanted to make her enemy bleed, but she had never imagined a wound like this, a wound to the very soul of a species. Kalen stood beside her, his expression grim. "We held up a mirror," he said, his voice low, "and they couldn't bear to look." The days that followed were a chaotic, uncertain dawn. Humanity was safe from extinction, but it was now adrift in a galaxy suddenly devoid of its masters. The cage was gone, but so was the zookeeper, and the other animals in the zoo were now stirring. Reports trickled in from deep space outposts of other species, long suppressed by the stewardship, beginning to test the boundaries of their old territories. The quiet, ordered galaxy the Proctors had maintained for eons was rapidly descending into a power vacuum, and humanity, scarred and exhausted, was standing at its epicenter. The Unchained, once a small band of rebels, were now the de facto authority in a system struggling to be reborn. Delegations from Earth and Mars arrived at Hephaestus. Their leaders, once dismissive of the rebellion, now looking to Kalen not as a renegade, but as a savior. They spoke of a new human coalition, of rebuilding, of taking their rightful place among the stars. They offered Kalen the title of First Citizen, Protector, leader of a new human age. He refused it all. He had no interest in building a new empire on the ashes of the old. "We didn't fight to replace one throne with another," he told the assembled delegates in the same cargo bay where he had once rallied his broken crews. "We fought for the right to make our own mistakes, to embrace the fever and learn to live with it, not to cure it. Our future isn't in a new government. It's in a million different futures, all of them loud and chaotic and human." He disbanded the Unchained, not with a formal decree, but by simply opening the doors of Hephaestus and letting its people go. The engineers went to rebuild the shattered infrastructure of Mars. The soldiers helped establish a new system-wide defense patrol. The artists and poets, Anya among them, returned to Earth to create a new culture, one forged in the fire of defiance. Anya found him in his lab one last time before she left. The glowing orchids were gone, replaced by simple, terrestrial plants, mosses, ferns, and a single, stubborn oak sapling growing under a sun lamp. "You're really going back to being a gardener?" she asked, a small, sad smile playing on her lips. "The universe will always need gardeners," he replied, his hands gently tending to the sapling. "But I'm done trying to prune the weeds. From now on, I think I'll just help things grow." He never returned to Earth. Kalen Rourke, the man who had brought a galactic empire to its knees with a handful of pollen, took a small, long-range survey ship and flew out into the darkness of the Oort cloud, seeking not a new world to conquer, but a quiet place to cultivate his garden. He became a myth, a ghost story told on the long, lonely nights between planets. Years turned into decades. Humanity, messy and brilliant, stumbled out into the wider galaxy. They did not conquer. They traded. They argued. They created. They made terrible mistakes and forged incredible alliances. They were a loud, vibrant, and often infuriating new voice in a cosmos that was slowly learning to sing a new song. They encountered the fractured remnants of the stewardship, the schisms, as they came to be called. Some were timid, isolationist enclaves, forever haunted by the ghosts of their past. Others had embraced a new, savage philosophy, becoming pirates and marauders. Humanity learned to fight them, to trade with them, and sometimes even to pity them. Anya Sharma became one of the most celebrated artists of the New Age. Her sculptures no longer made of explosives, but of light and sound. Vast, beautiful installations that told the story of their struggle and their survival. On the 50th anniversary of the Spire's fall, she unveiled her masterpiece in Earth's orbit, a colossal shimmering sculpture made from the salvaged, crystalline remains of the Tranquility Spire, its form not a monument to victory, but a swirling, chaotic representation of a fever dream. One day, an old woman now, she received a strange, unencrypted message broadcast on a primitive radio frequency. It was a simple string of botanical data, a genetic sequence for a new species of lichen, one capable of thriving on the bare rock of comets. There was no name attached, but Anya knew who had sent it. She smiled, a deep, genuine smile that reached her old, tired eyes. The gardener was still out there, quietly planting seeds in the darkness at the edge of the universe, not for an empire, but for life itself. The fever had not been cured. It had been set free. And in its beautiful, terrible, chaotic freedom, humanity had finally found its peace.